I've had a few questions here lately on stitch placement, like where do you put your stitch line, how far in on your material, depending on what you're making. How do you decide how far in to make your stitch line? I do often see that sometimes people stitch way too close to the edge. They need to get that stitch line back off into the material a little bit further because it doesn't give you enough room to edge. I'm gonna go over here to the bench right quick and I'm gonna show you exactly what I'm talking about as far as based on the thickness of your material and what you're stitching will decide how far in you want to go ahead and put that stitch line. We did the video before on the edgers. This is going to come in handy when it comes to selecting which edger you're going to use. So if you already know what size edger you're going to use on your project, that'll also help you to decide how far in your stitch line needs to be on your piece that you're making. So let's hop over here to the workbench. Okay, so I've got 3 different pieces here that are 3 different weights. So this is one of our custom belts. It finishes out to about 12 to 13 ounce, somewhere around there. It's a piece of 910 and a liner at 3/4. That's the same that we sell in our material packs. Same way I make all of my lined belts. Then we have one of our bifold wallets here. This is a 5/6 body, and then of course we use the goat skin on the inside for the interiors, which is about a 2 ounce, somewhere around there. So the finished product is thinner. It may be thicker down here at the bottom, like the belt, but the top is much thinner than the belt is. And then we've also got a flank cinch or a flank girt that comes that's going for that custom saddle that we finished, and so it's much thicker. It has a piece of thin down harness on the back, finished out to about probably 8 ounce, and then a 13-15 ounce body on this flank cinch. So those are 3 different weights of projects and kind of determining where your stitch placement is. And when we talk about stitch placement, it's on how far inside the project that you want to stitch that. That really boils down to the thickness of your material. So as you're building the project, if you'll keep that in mind, we talked about in the last video the edgers and selecting the proper edger size for the thickness of the material you're going to use. That'll also help you decide how far in your stitch placement needs to be. So if you'll imagine, if we were to stitch this flank cinch here, and we know that we're going to use, since it's very heavy material, if you watched our edger video, we want a rounded edge. So we want to use the biggest edger we can that'll accomplish that to give us a fully rounded edge, which means we're going to take off more material off the outer edge than a number 2 would. A number 2 is not going to take off very much. So what we're going to want to do is, we know we're going to use a number 5. We want to be sure that our stitch line is inside the edge of that material far enough so that we don't get into the stitches and that we're allowed to get the most material off of that project. If you were to stitch too close to the edge, you would have to use a smaller edger or hold this one differently so that you don't get into your stitches, which is going to end up getting you again to the squared off edge instead of the rounded edge. So that's kind of one of the main points with your stitch placement line as far as how in you go. If you're sewing like a wallet, this is, like I said, much thinner material. It's thicker on the bottom, but we're going to do the whole thing the same. Then we want to go ahead and set that stitch line so that the edger that we will use, which I use a number 3 on the wallets normally. And so I just want to be inside far enough so that when I edge that, I don't get into the stitches. When you go to set your border line, a lot of times you will set that stitch line just a hair inside of center from your cut border to the edge of your material, and that way when you edge it, your stitches look centered. That wallet, it could have been in just a little bit more, but like on this belt, when I first laid the groove, because we'll use a groover, I use this Horseshoe brand groover here from Jeremiah Watt Tools, and it works great. You can also use just the regular old Tandy edger here, and I'll use that a lot of times on belts and wallets, and then this one on the heavier leather. But when we first ran the groove for the stitch line, if you'd have seen this belt before we edged it, it actually looked a little off center compared to where our cut border line is and the edge of the material. But that's going to give a nice centered look once you edge your work. So that's not quite as important. I mean, you need to try to do that just so it's centered. If you look at this wallet, it looks a little off center. This one looks a little further out, so we've got more space of the red colored leather here than we do right here. So I would have liked to have moved that border in, or that stitch line in, just a little bit more, but you know, you learn as you go. So this one, you know, I'm on the next one, I kind of paid more attention and kind of brought it in just a little bit. But normally what it'll end up being is a good rule of thumb for your stitch line placement as far as a measurement. If you're looking for a measurement on that, I usually just eyeball it and I kind of go off a feel, but I know that that's years of working in this deal and you kind of get a feel for things. But a good rule of thumb is that you really want to have whatever the thickness of your material is, completely done before you stitch it. Ideally, they say you want to have half that distance is where your stitch line would be on the top. So if we were to measure this flank cinch right here, it's 3/8 of an inch thick, roughly, total thickness with the liner and everything on there. So that would be 3/16 from the inside. So if we come over here and try to eyeball where the edge is, I'm roughly 3/16 in from the outer edge of the material into where the stitch line is. So that's kind of a real good rule of thumb that you can use. So like on a belt, if you're sewing a belt here, and this belt here is roughly 3/16 of an inch thick, then we would want to be 1/16 and a half, right? So you just split that in half, and that's about where we are. That's about where it is. And like I said, what you can do, what I usually do just from appearance standpoint, is I will take whatever, I don't really measure it, okay? I don't measure anything, but I know that that's kind of the rule of thumb. But what ends up happening is I go just maybe a 30-second more on the inside on average, because I went through before I did this video and I checked all of mine, and whatever half the thickness of the material is, I'm in just a little bit more than that. I think it's always better to be a little bit further in than a little bit further out, because like I said, if you get too far out, your stitches may look a little off as far as being centered within your border by the time you edge it and slick it, or you can get them really, really close to the edge, which I've seen a lot, especially when we start out stitching really close to the edge, and when you do that, you don't have enough room to edge, and so it leaves you just being able to use like a number 2 or something just to barely roll that edge or bevel that edge, and then you end up with the block style slicked edge like we talked about in the edger video. So you want to be sure your stitch lines are in far enough so that when you're doing that, you can go ahead and get a good edge on there, and everything will be centered, and your stitches will be far enough in that if something, especially on a saddle, if something rubs this on the edge here and mars it up or cuts into the edge somehow, which will happen on a saddle a lot because they're so hard used, you'll end up getting into your stitches quicker. So we've got a lot of material here from the outer edge to where our stitches are. On a wallet or a belt, it's not quite as important, but I'd still like to see those stitches in just a little bit more so you can get it where you want it. Your stitches will look a lot better, your product will look a lot better, and it'll give you a little bit more room. Also, when you're sewing on the machine, it's much easier to keep that work stabilized as you're going through the machine because you've got more material on the outside of where the stitches are being laid. So that's stitch line placement. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, shoot us an email, but that should kind of give you a little idea. Remember, whatever your thickness is, half of that's how far in you need to be on the side. I appreciate you guys, and we'll see you on the next video.